A mom who drowned her own toddlers 30 years ago is hoping to be freed soon. But her former husband, who is also the children's father, is vehemently opposed to her ever stepping foot out of a prison. That's right, you guessed it, we're talking about Susan Smith. We're recapping the horrific case that shocked the nation and what her upcoming parole hearing could look like with prison consultant Justin Paperny. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. In 1994, Susan Smith shocked the nation when she intentionally left her car and drive with her 3-year-old son Michael and 14-month-old son Alexander still strapped in their car seats, and let the car drown in a South Carolina lake, killing both of her sons. Initially, Smith claimed a black man carjacked her and took off with her vehicle with her son still inside. And she painted a picture of herself as a worried mother, and she made pleas for her son's safe return.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home to us where they belong.
But investigators doubted Smith's story and believe she murdered her young children. Law&Crime's Anjanette Levy spoke with the prosecutor in the case, Tommy Pope, earlier this year for Law&Crime's Crime Fix. Pope referenced a time he knew something was off when Smith appeared to be delighted by the camera attention instead of worried about her sons.
You know, in a strange twist, and like you said, back then, you know, we didn't have all the different news sources we can, but she was drawn from the beginning to the opportunity and the attention of being on the media. I remember I had raw footage from Channel 7 out of Spartanburg that was the first people on the scene to the house she went to. They had called David to come to the scene, and they're about to do the video. The camera lights are off. That was back in the old days when you had a big boy like me carrying the cameras, and then you had the anchor person doing the work. You know? So they the anchor person says something to the effect, so David and Susan are standing in front of them ready for the camera, and she says, okay, you know, when the lights come on, then I'm going to ask you, you know, your name and then what happened, whatever. Right before the lights come on, Susan looks at David and kind of giggles like it's exciting, like they're going to be on TV, you know what I mean? And of course, poor David looks like a deer in the headlights. He looks like a guy who was just told your kids have been stolen. And so going through it, there were always kind of little instances, but I was going to say the media intensity, you know, because ultimately she was on every national media, you know, interviewed like the Today Show and all this stuff. And she was fine when she was getting the accolades and the sympathy. When they started questioning her a little bit, she started, you know, cracking. And so I think that media pressure helped. And then there were just slowly inconsistencies. The other thing is law enforcement always runs a dual investigation. If you tell me an alien took your child, then I'm going to go work on the alien case too, but I'm also going to check the logical things like family members. And so you know, sometimes people say that's offensive, but you have to check out the victim's family too to kind of check that off the list. Fortunately, they kept that working, and ultimately it proved they were looking in the right spot.
Stories like this one are obviously tough, but they're important to tell. And part of the reason we're able to do so is from our great sponsors like Upside. So what's Upside? It's a free app, yes, free, that gets you cash back on daily essentials like groceries and gas. It's actual real cash back. Money appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. Here's what you do. You download the Upside app, then claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. I went to 7-Eleven, got some Sour Patch Kids, and used the app, and honestly, it's super easy. You can use the app at Shell, Exxon, and my personal favorite, Taco Bell. To find out how much you could earn, download Upside or click the link in the description and use our promo code SIDEBAR to get 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Again, that's promo code SIDEBAR for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. Detectives searched nearby lakes and ponds, including John D. Long Lake, where they made the heartbreaking discovery, as it would turn into the site where Michael and Alexander's bodies were found. Smith told investigators she hadn't planned to murder her sons, claiming she wasn't in the right state of mind. But when Smith went to trial a year after the shocking crime, prosecutors revealed another bombshell that would give insight into why Smith killed her young sons. The prosecution argued Susan Smith wanted to get rid of her son so she could continue an affair and start a new life with a former lover who didn't want children. However, the defense argued Smith had mental health issues and drove to the edge of the lake to kill herself and her two sons, but her body willed itself out of the car. It didn't take long for a jury to convict Smith, only 2 hours of deliberations. After her conviction, the prosecution argued in favor of the death penalty, but the jury decided on life in prison with the possibility of parole in 30 years. Bringing us to this year in 2024. We're just months away from her parole hearing, and Susan Smith is fighting for her chance to be free again. But for Susan Smith, the freedom that she's seeking might not happen, especially if her former husband has a say. According to the New York Post, Smith reached out to her ex, begging him not to oppose her bid for release. But a family member of David Smith told the Post he 100% opposes her release from prison. The relative said, quote, "He has every right to stand in her way, and that's exactly what he's about to do. She killed his kids, causing him a lifetime of heartbreak. If she thinks he's going to stand by while she tries to get out of jail, she's even more delusional than we even thought." But even after Susan Smith was convicted, she didn't clean up her act. She was caught using drugs and having sex with prison guards. In 2000, Smith was written up for having sex 4 times with a 50-year-old prison guard, Houston Cagle. He pled guilty and spent time behind bars himself when he was sentenced to 3 months in jail. Then in 2001, Captain Alfred Rowe Jr. also pled guilty and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. Both men also lost their jobs. Prison officials say Smith has stayed out of trouble since 2015. Instead, family members say Smith has kept busy making plans on what she'll do if she's released on parole. But with her former husband opposing her release and her prior infractions, how possible is it that the killer mom could actually be granted parole? We're breaking that down with prison consultant Justin Paperny. Justin, welcome. I think a lot of people might be shocked that Susan Smith is actually up for parole this year in just a few months. And this case truly shocked the nation. How likely is it that she could actually be released on parole?
I would say it's unlikelier because she hasn't built a record through the last 30 years in prison that would demonstrate why she's even a candidate. It's one thing to say, I think I want to go home, I've earned it. It's another to have actually built a record over the last 30 years that she could actually rely on. Because to me, at least, it doesn't appear as if she's done that work that could influence a parole board. I would say it's very unlikely she succeeds. And I know that's to the happiness of her ex-husband.
And that brings me to my next question. Her former husband, David Smith, is very against her ever getting out of prison for what she did to their sons. How much of his say will actually go into account for the parole board?
The victim's statement is probably the most significant. And you could argue that he might have been a little bit more sympathetic if she had built a record over a sustained period of time. We interview federal and state judges, and you hear from judges or parole boards, what does it take to succeed? Get out of prison early, get probation or parole. The prisoner has to build a record that shows what have they learned? Why would this never happen again? The devastation you've done to other people, how you will be law-abiding if you get released. A crime like this may never lead to a release, but at least she could have shown that she is a candidate, even though the husband would oppose it. But his statement, it is a big deal, and it's the biggest reason she most likely gets denied now and for the rest of her life.
And the opposition from her husband, as well as the past infractions she got for using drugs, having sex with prison guards, that coupled with her ex-husband not wanting her to be released, is there really anything that's working in her favor?
Zero, other than she's served 30 years thus far, and calendar pages have turned, and she's 30 years removed from her crime. It is a shame when people think they have earned an early release, yet there's no evidence that demonstrates why they're worthy of an earlier release. Her behavior in prison, the infractions, sleeping with guards, if anything shows she doesn't get it, she is incapable of making good decisions. And a parole board is simply going to ask a question. Has she done anything to demonstrate that she would be law-abiding on the other side? Unlikely if she can't follow the rules inside of a controlled prison environment. No chance.
And do you think Susan Smith ever really changed? During her trial, prosecutors said she killed Michael and Alexander because she didn't want to be a mom. She doesn't seem to show any remorse for what she had done. And since being locked up, there's been this pattern of Susan Smith seemingly having a trail of men in her pathway. What are your thoughts?
She's done very little to demonstrate that she's changed, that she's worthy or have earned a second chance. What she is doing is what some people in prison who have to do. Happy talk, cliches. I've served 30 years. I think I've earned another chance. Please don't get in the way of my parole. mean absolutely nothing. Has any record been built that demonstrates why she's a candidate for parole? Of course not. And of course, she will continue to play the victim when it's denied. People are against me, my ex-husband and others. It's not fair. That's one way to serve time. It makes you feel better, but all it really does is get in the way of fully accepting responsibility and acknowledging and sharing and owning that she destroyed lives. And until she can acknowledge that, more misery to come for her and others she continues to hurt.
And that hearing is just a few months away in November. What could her parole hearing actually look like?
Well, I presume most people who actually want parole, we have a nonprofit, for example, that does work in every California prison. And people who are trying to qualify for an early release, they demonstrate through their own efforts how they got to prison, what have they learned, if they're engaged in programming, how is the programming helping them, if they're reading literature, why, how will the work in prison help them become a law-abiding citizen after their release. She hasn't done that. So you can't expect her to start that over the next 3 months. You'll probably have some lawyer, some advocate expressing why she's a candidate for release. She's served 30 years. But you're only successful if the prisoner has built a record that shows, and from what I've read and heard, she's had 30 years to build that record. And instead of doing it positively and growing it and documenting what she's learned, she's continued on this path of bad decision making. It's why the parole board denying her, in my opinion, will be a formality now and for the foreseeable future. She hasn't earned it.
Now, say Susan Smith's parole is denied. Would she have another opportunity to go to the parole board? And if so, how long would that be?
I don't know the exact length of time, but I presume it could be 5-10 years, depending on South Carolina and however long it takes. I know if she is denied, it's probably an opportunity for her, if she has some ability to introspect, to say, okay, why did they deny me? What led me here? What could I do in advance of the next parole hearing to say, I heard why you denied me. I understand why. Here's a record I've begun to build that demonstrates why I am now a candidate. In fact, I wish I had done this for the first 30 years. Now I've done it for the next 5 or 10. The problem with that is it actually takes work. It actually takes acceptance of responsibility, introspection, avoiding problems, avoiding sleeping with staff, avoiding complaining. It actually takes work. And not everyone is willing to do the work. And until she does that, more problems are coming.
Now, say by chance Susan Smith, takes accountability for what she did. She shows remorse while at the parole hearing. Do you think her showing maybe some last minute remorse might actually have a sway on the parole board?
That's why we interview judges. The answer is, of course not. It's happy talk. It's one thing to say, I'm sorry, I accept responsibility, which judges or a parole board, they expect to hear that. It is discounted. Here's what they will say. Where is the evidence behind the remorse? Where is the evidence that you have changed? Where is the evidence that you have learned from this experience? Where is the evidence that you identify with the victims and families and lives you have destroyed forever? She could say she's sorry. It will have zero significance because she has not built a record that proves that she is truly sorry. It's nothing more, as judges would tell you, nothing more than happy talk.
And do you think that Susan Smith might be delusional in a way to think that she actually could step foot out of a prison in a few months?
Look, hope is a good thing, right? You can convince yourself in that isolated environment that relief is possible, that someone on that parole board will have sympathy for her, that perhaps her life has changed over the last 30 years. So certainly hope is a good thing. But if you haven't built a record, there's no reason to be hopeful. You're simply delusional. And that's exactly what we have here. She should only have some hope if she had a documented record of growth, productivity, lessons learned, and building a record that shows why she's a candidate, even if it's a small percentage. That's when you have hope. If you haven't done the work, you're simply delusional.
Do you think that if she doesn't get out of prison, that she may in a way just say, you know what, forget it, this is all a waste, like I'm not going to go up for my next parole hearing, time after time after time again? She just might sit with what she did and stay the rest of her life in prison. Do you think that's also a possibility?
Sure. Some people convince themselves that I've done everything I could and they didn't reward it. So why would I continue to do it if they're not going to reward it? It's kind of this ends justify the means, so fixated on an end, and they're only doing it because of the result they want rather than doing it for the right reasons. And until she begins to do it for the right reasons over a sustained period of time, she will continue to get denied parole. She will continue to play the victim and blame other people. So sure, there's a chance she gives up, says, that's a wrap, nothing I do matters. I would ask her, what actually have you done? What if you documented? What have you proven over the last 3 years that demonstrates why you are a candidate for parole? And that's a tough one because it requires people to introspect. And if they can own it and finally say, I haven't done a damn thing, hence the reason she has more struggle coming.
And Justin, this is really just a shocking case that had happened, again, 30 years ago. But take me back to the 90s where you may have heard of this case. What was your mind and what was just the general sentiment across the nation about what Susan Smith did and was later convicted of?
Well, when you hear about it, it's tragic. And initially, I was only 19 then, and I immediately had huge sympathy for the family because she pinned it on, I think, African Americans who she said kidnap them. So it takes waste police resources investigating people who might have committed this crime. So you immediately have sympathy, like, my God, this family lost their 2 beautiful young children. This is awful. But it just continues to show her criminal thinking, how she was strategizing to try to pin this on other people. So I recall reading it, my initial sympathy went to the parents. And then when it was clear that she did it, it went, of course, to the father and the young children who were killed. I remember reading it vividly. I was a student at USC, and I'll never forget it.
Yeah, it was truly just a heartbreaking case. Justin, thank you so much, really, for being here. We really appreciate your time. Before we sign you off, is there anything else about this case you would like to add?
If you have someone in prison and they want to get out earlier, and they are truly committed to making amends, it's got to be documented. You got to build it. You got to show progress for a cynical judge or a cynical parole board who expects you to say, I'm sorry, let me out. If you haven't built and documented, it's not going to happen. Do the work and convey to cynical stakeholders why you're a candidate for leniency. Without that, expect to stay in prison longer.
All right, Justin, again, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Susan Smith's parole hearing is scheduled for November 4th. And of course, we'll continue to follow this very closely. But for now, that's all the time we have on this episode of Sidebar. Check out more episodes and please subscribe to us anywhere you listen to your podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. I'm Elizabeth Millner, and this has been Sidebar presented by Law&Crime.